Okay, in this short lecture, we're going to go over some of the main endocrine glands, and then we'll also discuss uh, what these glands release or secrete. And it's really important that when you study endocrinology and the endocrine system, that you write out on a sheet of paper, you would write out the gland, and then you would write out the hormones that they release, and then you would write out what their primary or main functions are, okay? So that's the main concept to the endocrine system. What does it release, and what is its main function? What does it do? Sometimes hormones are released and they're going to stimulate other parts of the body to release something. And we will show you that. We'll show you that when we go over the relationship between the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the thyroid gland. Sometimes we refer to that axis as the HPT axis. And there is another axis that's pretty popular that's called the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And believe it or not, I have a short video that talks about how these crosstalk with one another. And generally speaking, when we think of the adrenals, we think of stress, adrenal stress, and the adrenal gland releasing and producing cortisol when an individual is under stress. And I have a separate video that talks about the crosstalk between the adrenal gland and the thyroid gland, and how when the adrenal gland is pushing out cortisol, that it can down-regulate thyroid function. And we do see a large amount of hypoactive thyroids today, and we seem to be under quite a bit of stress lately. So let's take a look at the hypothalamus. When you look at the word, we see thalamus there, and thalamus is part of the brain. It is the part of the brain that deals with all of the sensory input that comes into it. But this is the hypothalamus, which means it's below the thalamus. And it's involved in producing anti-diuretic hormone and oxytocin. Now, the ADH, anti-diuretic hormone, and oxytocin that is released is going to be stored in the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. It's stored in the posterior lobe of the pituitary. You see there's an anterior lobe and there's a posterior lobe of the pituitary. And you can see here that the oxytocin and ADH that's stored can be released by the posterior lobe. Now, ADH, anti-diuretic hormone, if we look at it, we have to say, well, what's a diuretic, right? A diuretic is something that makes a person urinate. Like alcohol is a diuretic. Coffee is a diuretic. So anti-diuretic is going to have the opposite effect. It's going to tell the person to hold on to water or retain water, not to excrete it through urination. Okay? So anti-diuretic is going to make the person hold on to water. And one thing that I want you to keep in mind is that water and minerals go hand in hand, right? I mean, you've heard of mineral water, and that's the best water to drink. Water that contains minerals, because that's how it's found in nature, right? Water in a stream travels over rocks, and water will extract the minerals from the rocks, and now you have mineral water. So water is always looking for minerals. So if you drink water that's not mineral water, let's say it's poisonous water like distilled water, and it's pure H2O, and you drink that distilled water, which is typically used to clean heavy machinery, it's now in the body without minerals, so it's going to be looking for minerals within the body, which means it's going to leach it out of certain parts of the body, like the bones and certain tissues and certain organs. So please always make sure if you're drinking water, it should be mineral water. Okay, so that's the hypothalamus. It does produce antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. It stores it in the posterior lobe of the pituitary. There's an anterior and a posterior lobe. The other name for anterior lobe is called adenohypophysis, adenohypophysis. And the other name for posterior lobe is called the neurohypophysis, the neurohypophysis. The anterior lobe, you could see that it releases quite a few hormones, whereas the posterior lobe only releases 1 and 2 hormones. So what are some of the hormones that are released by the anterior lobe? We have ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone. We have TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. We have GH, growth hormone. PRL, which is prolactin, or prolactin releasing hormone, right? This is really prolactin, PRL. Then we have FSH, follicular stimulating hormone. And we have luteinizing hormone, LH. And then we have melanocyte stimulating hormone. That's from the anterior pituitary. Posterior, just oxytocin and ADH. We'll get over what some of their functions are shortly. The thyroid gland produces T4 and T3, predominantly T4. T4 gets converted into T3, and that conversion, for the most part, takes place in an organ called the liver. And it is selenium dependent, so we'll put Se for selenium. So T4 to T3 conversion, some of it takes place in the thyroid, but most of the metabolism takes place in the liver, and it is selenium dependent. And when we think of thyroid, we think of metabolism for the most part, right? Most people think if someone has a fast metabolism, they can eat, and they can't put on a pound. And then if someone has a slow metabolism or a hypoactive thyroid, they just think about an ice cream sundae without eating it and they can put on weight, right? We've kind of heard that analogy. The other hormone that the thyroid gland makes is called calcitonin. Now, the thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland, these two here, are going to work together. And that's because if I were to draw for you the thyroid, it looks like a letter H, and it's found in the throat. Okay, that's your thyroid. And there's 2 lobes, right? There's 1 lobe here, and there's 1 lobe here. There's 2 lobes. And then there's this connection between the two that's called the isthmus. Now, within each of those lobes, see if I can change the color here to blue, there's going to be parathyroid glands found in each of these lobes, but on the posterior side, right? Because this wraps around, you can see the thyroid here, it wraps around to the posterior side. So those parathyroid glands are found more on the posterior lobe of it, not on the anterior. All right. So the thyroid is releasing this hormone called calcitonin, whereas the parathyroid releases PTH, which is parathyroid hormone. And those 2 hormones work together in harmony, but they have opposite effects. And I'll go into that in more detail, but again, they're involved in regulating the balance of calcium, which is really important in the body, calcium. Then we have the adrenal gland. And the adrenal gland, when I go over it, I'll show you it has 2 portions to it. It has an outer portion called the cortex and has an inner portion called the adrenal medulla. And the adrenal cortex is involved in releasing glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids. The biggies are going to be cortisol, cortisone, corticosterone. Those are glucocorticoids. It's also involved in releasing a mineral corticoid called aldosterone. Mineral corticoid. In the word mineral corticoid, you see corticoid for cortex, and then mineral because it's involved in the regulation and balance of sodium, Na, sodium. The adrenal cortex, I said, pushes out glucocorticoids, cortex, gluco for glucose metabolism. The adrenal medulla, which is the inner part, deals with catecholamines, especially epinephrine and norepinephrine, also known as adrenaline or noradrenaline. Okay? And I'll go over the adrenal gland in more detail as I'll go over the thyroid in another video, the adrenal glands in another video. I'll go through the main parts. The pancreas, we said, is endocrine and exocrine, so it's a mixed gland, but the two hormones they're showing here, insulin and glucagon, are the endocrine portion. They are, insulin is secreted by the islets of Langerhans, the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans, and glucagon is released by the alpha cells of the islets of Langerhans. Again, those are endocrine. Exocrine deals with the digestive enzymes, like pancreatic protease, pancreatic carbohydrase, and pancreatic lipase. All right, what else do we have? We have in the brain, besides the hypothalamus and the pituitary, those are in the brain. We also have the pineal or pineal gland that releases melatonin. Melatonin helps tone us down at night. It's involved in our sleep cycles, melatonin. It's released at nighttime, and it helps us sleep. There's lots of research these days in melatonin in two areas, primarily in the management and treatment of COVID. Lots of new research involving melatonin there. And melatonin is also used to help treat people with irritable bowel syndrome and IBD, okay, for the gut. Okay, we also have the heart. Right now, these have secreting cells. The thymus has secreting cells. Fat cells have secreting cells. Your digestive tract and the kidneys and the gonads, all of these have secreting cells. We don't really think of them as endocrine glands, but they have endocrine secreting cells, okay? So the heart does release ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, and in the word atrial natriuretic, the first two letters of natriuretic or natriuretic is Na, which is sodium, right? We saw sodium linked with aldosterone. So aldosterone is going to help us conserve sodium. And if we hold on to sodium, remember I said mineral water, if we hold on to sodium, we're going to hold on to water. Whereas ANP is going to help us get rid of sodium. And if we're getting rid of sodium, we're getting rid of water. Okay? So sodium and water go together. You lose water, you lose minerals. You hold on to sodium, or you hold on to minerals, you hold on to water. You hold on to water, you hold on to minerals. The thymus gland is found near the sternum. It really increases in size for the first few years of life, and then it starts to atrophy as we get older. It's involved in our T cell function and immune cell function. It secretes thymosins, which is involved in our immune system function, especially when we talk about T cells. Fat cells or adipose tissue, they're going to secrete leptin. That's involved in appetite suppression. When you eat food that does have fat in it, you do get full or fuller quicker. Okay. Adipose also releases cytokines, which can be inflammatory, and they make any type of inflammatory condition or disease worse. It can make MS worse, Parkinson's, rheumatoid arthritis, cancer, and multiple sclerosis. Any type of inflammatory disease can make worse. The digestive tract, we have cells in the intestines, like the duodenum, can release something called CCK, cholecystokinin, that will stimulate the gallbladder to release bile. The kidneys secrete erythropoietin, and that's because all the blood is going to go through the kidneys. It goes through the liver, but it also goes through the kidneys. And the kidneys make a perfect organ to say, what is the blood oxygen levels like, right? Because red blood cells carry hemoglobin. Hemoglobin binds to oxygen. So if oxygen levels are low, they're going to say, hey, the person's anemic. They have low oxygen levels, maybe because they have low iron, and then they have low oxygen, and the body doesn't like low oxygen. So the kidneys will secrete erythropoietin. This goes to the bone marrow, and the bone marrow is going to push out more red blood cells. More red blood cells, more hemoglobin, the better opportunity to bind to oxygen. The kidneys are also involved in vitamin D synthesis. So here we have calcitriol, which is vitamin D. The testes in the male are involved in secreting testosterone, and the ovaries in the female can secrete estrogen and progestin or progesterone. Okay, so this is a general introduction, and when I come back, I'll get into a little bit more detail of how some of these axes work between the hypothalamus, pituitary, and thyroid, and hypothalamus, pituitary, and the adrenal axis.